July 20th, 1969. Apollo Lunar Module.
Preparing for launch, sir.
A euphonic voice said through the radio.
All right, boys. Prepare yourselves for the worst, and remember, we have to come back home to our families. Let's get ready to make history, boys,
Neil said in a very enthusiastic tone. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. They were all forced to lay on their backs as the engines ignited. They heard 2 to 3 seconds of vibrations and the rattling roar of the engines. The clock had reached 0 as a force pushed against them so hard it was like being on a roller coaster gliding down with full speed. The engines throttled up and down as the rocket started to take off. They approached the stratosphere. The engines were still shaking, but had started stabilizing themselves.
6 minutes for rocket to leave the exosphere,
a voice from the radio said. They held themselves tight as they were about to leave the planet. Then, the engines went silent. They had just left the planet.
Sir, do you copy? We've just left the Blue Boy,
Neil said with a huge smile on his face as the whole crew on the control pad down on Earth rejoiced.
Buckle up, guys. The journey has just started,
the captain on the control pad said with a smirk on his face. Nobody had been to the moon. They were going to set history, as they told themselves before leaving their beds. It had been 2 days since the 3 astronauts left Earth. They were trying to normalize the whole space-living life. They were going to be there for a while. Finally, after 3 days in space, they were able to see the moon from their shuttle.
Sir, do you have copy? We've just set eyes on the white boy,
Neil Strongsville radioed back to the control pad on Earth.
Congratulations, boys. You've done a great job. Get ready to make history,
the captain said with an optimistic voice. They couldn't wait to see who was going to be the first to set foot on the moon. They bargained throughout the ride, but Neil always saw himself as the alpha amongst them. So he and Alan Flame struck a deal that whoever set foot on the moon first would mount the flag. They had just approached the moon. The shuttle had just landed. They were scared. For men who argued about how they were going to walk on the moon, they all looked terrified.
This is Neil here, Captain. Permission to begin descent, sir,
Neil said.
Permission granted, Neil,
the captain said. They were already in their spacesuits. There were 2 doors on the space shuttle that could be opened. Neil picked the flag. They were going to mount the flag at the distance 100 or more from the space shuttle. The door opened, and before Neil stepped down, Alan had already beat him to it.
Neil, do you copy? Have you boys dropped?
The captain said.
Yes, Captain. I was first to drop off. I am the first person to set foot on the moon,
Neil said. Neil never got along with Alan. He always saw him as a threat to his position as head astronaut. But was Neil right when he said he was the first person to set foot on the evening sun? The moon had been there for way longer than man knew about space. Neil couldn't help think, what if? Alan hadn't moved far from the shuttle when something caught his eyes through his visor. It was a paw print. But this was different. It looked like that of a gigantic lizard, and also that of a bear. Neil noticed and immediately got interested in what Alan was staring at, and so he moved closer.
Something's up here,
Alan said, breathing heavily.
Extraterrestrial? Possibly. You know, if truly there's a monster up here and we spot it, we have no weapons to fight it, right?
Neil said as he held Alan back by the shoulder.
Who said anything about fighting? A little curiosity won't hurt. Where's your sense of adventure?
Alan said with a grin on his face, visible from his see-through visor. They followed the prints, and it felt like they were chasing shadows. Neil got exhausted from the search, which proved futile when the trail went cold, without warning. They had already covered some ground on the moon when they decided to mount the flag. Neil hoisted it with zest and patriotism.
Sir, do you copy? Flag is firmly rooted. We are officially the first folks on the moon,
Neil said with an optimistic voice as he radioed NASA.
Once again, boys, congratulations. You have a few minutes to savor the view, then report back to base. Don't forget to send in a probe for surveillance,
the captain said. Suddenly, the radio went offline, and a bright light appeared at a corner of a rock. They both saw it and froze in sheer shock.
What the hell was that?
Neil asked, startled. The light beamed. Its presence could not be ignored. They both looked at themselves. Alan could see from Neil's body expression that he wanted to leave that very moment. But he would rather be called a bum by others than to be called one by Alan. So he stood his ground.
We have to check it out,
Alan said as he tilted his head towards Neil. Neil nodded as Alan took the first step. Neil was uncertain of what he was doing, but he tagged along. They drew near the bright light. Alan was the adventurous one, and he couldn't wait to see what the bright light had to offer.
What the hell, Alan? I'm out of here,
Neil said, stepping back in great fear as they peeped over the large rock, a huge boulder of some sorts. They walked slowly towards the glowing light, which grew brighter like the dawn, breaking into full day.
Oh shit! Aliens! Friggin' aliens!
Neil cried, holding Alan back by the shoulders.
Calm down, man,
Alan said in a very calm tone. They peeped once again. More paw prints could be seen, but no form of life. Just the bright light. They tentatively walked closer to see the light, but as they got closer to the source, they were shocked to see that it cast a long shadow. This same shadow served as a portal leading somewhere from the echo that came booming out of it. It looked dazzling and surreal.
Okay, back off and let's go.
Neil wasn't kidding. Whatever they were looking at was way above their pay grade, and most importantly, it was above what they signed up for. As they were about to leave, they saw something coming towards them from afar. It raged at them with an unreal speed. It was an alien. It looked like a spider, but with teeth like that of a saber-toothed tiger. It raced towards them, and as they turned to flee towards the opposite direction, it had already caught up with them. Besides, they were in spacesuits, and this being defied all the laws of gravity they knew. It stared at them as if it hungered for their very souls. It raced towards them, knocking them out cold and breaking Neil's oxygen tank. Alan was unconscious as Neil struggled to crawl close enough to detach his oxygen tank and replace the broken one with it. Neil raced out with the last strength he had toward the space shuttle. Alan had just opened his eyes, then noticed that his oxygen tank was no more, and he was losing air faster than a deflated weather balloon. The alien was gathering momentum to charge towards him this time. I had no choice. Neil thought as he scuttled for the shuttle, urging the astronaut to get the engine running after convincing him that something had gotten hold of Alan and was coming for them, if they didn't get the hell out of there. Alan's survival instincts kicked in, and he used his already dwindling strength to roll into the portal. He strongly felt there had to be room for him to breathe there. Everything suddenly transitioned into an environment he had never set foot on before, but he had no strength to move a muscle. His eyes flickered, and his vision turned blurry. Then just like that, everything went dark and quiet. The Raven, 1974. A scrambled signal was received on the Raven, NASA's first, recent, and only space station. Emily Harcourt had just gotten a distress signal on her monitor. A scrambled signal coming 400 kilometers to the north of the Raven. But there was nothing there, from all indications. Why was the signal coming from the moon? Why now? What could that be? A boatload of questions was written all over her face as she reached out for her radio. Alpha 21B, do you copy? There's a situation here in the surveillance room. Over, Emily said. Omega 41D, we copy and we'll be right there. Over, Donald replied with an urgent tone as he rushed towards the surveillance room. He dashed into the room and headed for Emily at her workstation. What's the situation, Emily? Donald asked, looking at her monitor with his right arm resting on the armrest of her swivel chair, which was bolted to the floor. Emily nodded towards the signal. But there's nothing there, Donald said after a brief pause. I believe we should check it out, sir. You know what happened the last time someone went to check out the moon? Donald replied rhetorically. Fine. I'll go alone then, Emily said as she stood up from her seat. Okay, fine. I'll go with you. I'll get the shuttle ready. Emily smiled at him as they exited the room. They were prepping themselves to get into the shuttle as the commander of the Raven approached them. Alpha 21B and Omega 41D. Who authorized this mission? The commander asked authoritatively after they told him what they planned to do. We found a scrambled signal on the moon, sir, so we decided to go check it out and know whether it's a threat, Emily said as she gave a salute to the commander. No one is embarking on anything unless I approve. Is that clear, soldier? Yes, sir, Donald replied. Good. Now take off the suits, get back to your stations before anything drastic happens, the commander said firmly as he turned and started for his quarters. Emily's stubborn mind didn't let her take the commander's orders at face value. Instead, she prepped herself up and got into the shuttle after he had left. Donald was shocked seeing her disobey the commander's direct order, but he knew how stubborn she was when she believed she had a lead on something. Especially one that might be from Alan Flame. Emily never believed Alan was dead, even after 5 years of not hearing a word from him. Don couldn't stop her, and he couldn't let her go alone, so he got in with her. You know we're going to get court-martialed if we make it back alive, right? Donald said as he buckled up and ran through the checklist for the space shuttle. I need closure, Don. I need to be sure. The moon. Everything seemed calm. They had just arrived at the eastern part of the moon, the same place Neil Strongsville and Alan Flame had first landed. Nothing looked out of place, but Emily and Don knew something was wrong because NASA had kept a tight leash on expeditions to the moon for the last 5 years. Something moved ahead, behind a pile of boulders. Then it coughed, causing Emily and Don to stop dead in their tracks. Then it coughed again, and this time they crept closer till they were directly behind the boulder. They stole a glance in between the space of a loose boulder and a larger one. What they saw drained the blood out of their faces. Right in front of them was the last person they expected to see, even though he was the reason Emily dared come this far. "Alan!" Emily cried as she went over to the boulder to meet him, tears forming in her eyes. Don followed directly behind her, then froze when he realized something was off. Alan had no helmet on, which wasn't possible, at least as far as Don was concerned. Emily was too teary to see Alan after searching for him so long and hitting brick walls every time she brought up the subject to her superiors. "Alan," she stuttered. "What? How? This isn't even possible. It's been 5 years." She ran her gloved hands over his face, doubting the reality of it all. Alan's eyes flickered drowsily, almost as if he had been in a coma for the last 5 years. But it all came rushing back to him in an instant, causing his eyes to widen with the realization that he wasn't safe. Jolting to his feet in lightning speed, it took him a minute to access the two strangers in front of him, to realize that it was Emily and Donald. They weren't even astronauts when he had left. "Run!" Alan shrieked as he pulled out a dangling thread of grenades and loosed the hook off one.
"Alan, how are you alive and breathing on the moon?"
Don was deeply puzzled and frightened about everything. "Let's get the hell out of here! I'll tell you all about it later!" Alan was already urging them to get going, just as a bright light suddenly appeared from nowhere, casting a long shadow on the ground. The same long shadow which he had rolled into 5 years ago, taking him 20,000 years into the past, to a civilization that thrived on the moon. But due to how advanced they were in technology, they predicted the damnation of their own species in the current future timeline. This caused them to create a time loop, which repeated a particular span of time over and over again. This affected their intellectual abilities. It meant they couldn't know beyond what they already knew, no matter how hard they tried. The portal was created by beings called deviants, who didn't believe in the ruling echelon's goal of saving them from themselves. The portal was the closest thing the deviants had to break free from the time loop. Alan wasn't going to let that happen, and so he threw the dangling thread of grenades into the shadow as he ran for safety. 1, 2, boom! The ear-splitting sound could be heard for miles. Yet as soon as it went off, it imploded and disappeared, destroying the portal and the last of the deviants who had knowledge of the portal. Hey, sci-fi horror fans. It's Thomas. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to give it a thumbs up and leave a comment. And remember, stay cosmic.